Lovely, thank you very much. So my name is Louise Robinson and I am the Click Sergeant Specialist Nurse Key Worker based in Nottingham, and I'm working with children from all over the East Midlands with brain and spinal tumours. And a massive part of that role is, as you would probably imagine, is looking at helping those children and young people either to get back into education or supporting them in education in the kind of longer term. So, what is the impact of having a brain tumour on education? Well, sadly, we do know that over 60% of children who are survivors of a brain tumour do go on to have some form of ongoing disability as a result of this. But that level of disability varies quite considerably. So there are some children that I've worked with who would come in for surgery, just have an operation for their tumour, maybe stay in hospital for less than a week, and then be back to school within sometimes a number of weeks, quite incredibly. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are children or young people who would need much more extensive treatment. They might have a less smooth recovery from their surgery. We've already heard earlier on this afternoon about the impact of things like posterior fossa syndrome. And the treatment that these children are undergoing often too can impact on their recovery. So chemotherapy and radiotherapy can impact on the children in the longer term. So there was a really good piece of research done a couple of years ago by the Brain Tumour Charity in 2016 called Losing My Place, the reality of childhood with a brain tumour. And this looked at the impact on education. And in that piece of research, 90% of participants said that their education had been affected by their tumour or their treatment. And nearly 2/3 of them felt that they needed extra help in school because of that. But school in itself is a really excellent form of rehabilitation. When you think about school, really, it's work for children, isn't it? And any child in school is learning, they're developing, they're working on their physical abilities, they're working on their cognitive abilities. So actually that environment, once a child's had their treatment and they've been sent home from hospital, we've obviously done a lot of work with them while they've been in hospital. They might have had rehabilitation with our therapists as an inpatient, but once they get home, actually school is a really excellent place for them to continue their recovery if they can get the right kind of support once they get into education. But returning to school can be quite an anxiety-provoking experience for both the child, the family, and for schools as well. Almost all of the schools that I've worked with have never supported a child with a brain tumour before I've gone in and met with them. It would be very unusual for them to have more than one pupil. So it's a new experience for them, and they don't always know where to begin with that. So supporting school is as important as supporting the family. And that's where the child's healthcare team come in. They can provide that vital role of providing information and linking within the health team to school to make sure that schools do really understand their needs in order to be able to meet them. So working with education. I should say that I'm not an expert at working with education. What I've learned doing this job, I've learned on the job really. There's one or two people in the room who've been along that journey with me. So it's been a learn as you go along experience. But these are some of the things that I found helpful. So an identified key worker is a really good starting point to provide that link for the family between health and education. And for somebody to work with the school and to advocate for that pupil. So that's really useful. That might be somebody like myself, doesn't have to be. I also work with our local outreach nurses and with other professionals who can be that link person, but as long as school's got somebody that they can go to and the family's got somebody that they can go to that they know can support them. Sharing information is really important. Providing information about the different needs of the child, whether they're physical, cognitive or psychosocial, to enable the school to start that planning process. And when we're working with a pupil who has got quite complex needs, early meetings with schools are really helpful. Also liaising with special educational needs teams can be really helpful to troubleshoot potential difficulties. Sometimes you might be working with a school that's really well prepared to welcome someone into the school who's got a new acquired disability. Some schools are very modern, very well adapted for children with all sorts of disabilities. Some schools are beautiful old buildings that are really, really lovely, but actually are not necessarily all that practical for helping somebody in a child who's maybe coming back to school in a wheelchair or something like that. So actually getting a feel early on for what the child's needs might be and how complex they're going to be, and how well the school is going to be able to respond to that based on their own particular situation as well, can be really helpful. So we always try and meet with schools or make contact with schools as early as possible to try and, like I say, troubleshoot that. It's also useful if we need to start looking at funding applications. These things can sometimes take time. So if we know that somebody's going to need quite a bit of support in school, the earlier we get the ball rolling with that, the better. Another thing just to say is this isn't a one-off thing. When I first started the job, I thought I would meet with the pupils. I thought I'd go into the school, I'd talk to the school, and that would be it, tick, job done. But it really isn't as simple as that. So this is an ongoing role, really. As we know, children change as they develop through childhood into adolescence, and their needs definitely change too, particularly when we're talking about their cognitive needs. So ongoing support is really important, and it's really helpful if both the family and the school know that they can come back to us if they're struggling, and we can do a little bit more work to try and help that child get the support they need. So, potential difficulties. I tend to split this up really into the physical, cognitive and psychosocial, but as Emma pointed out very nicely in her last slide, these things all link with each other, don't they? They don't sort of work in isolation, so something that impacts you physically is also going to have an impact on you psychosocially, for example. So we're going to just look at those in a little bit more detail now. This isn't meant to cover everything, it's just meant to give a feel for some of the difficulties that our children and young people can face. So mobility and fine motor difficulties are something we see quite a bit of, particularly when you've got children with things like posterior fossa syndrome. And acquired disability is something that is going to be difficult for schools to get their head around if a child's levels of ability is changing quite quickly in terms of their mobility and things like that. We also see communication difficulties sometimes, as has been mentioned earlier on. And visual problems is something that comes around actually really very often for children with brain tumours, and it's something that we monitor quite closely for all of our patients. So identifying those who have got visual difficulties and making sure that schools are adhering to advice about how to support them in school is really, really important. A lot of our local authorities have got specialist teachers for visual impairment and also for hearing impairment that can provide advice on that. So identifying these pupils and making sure they're referred to the relevant team is really, really important. So just looking at some of the things that can be helpful for physical difficulties. Obviously, when we're working with an individual child, we will look at their specific needs and put in a plan that's unique to them. But actually, some of the things that we do are useful for a lot of our pupils and can be kind of applied for many of those children. So first and foremost, we'd seek advice from the involved therapists. We're really lucky in Nottingham that we've got a specialist team called the Brill team. They work with children with acquired brain injury and they see all our brain tumour patients. And they're available to provide advice not only to schools but also to therapists in the community around the specific support that our individual pupils might need. Also, there may be therapists in the community, and like I say, those specialist teams as well for visual impairment, hearing impairment, that sort of thing, So involving them as early as possible and making sure school are in contact with them and are getting advice from the appropriate people is really helpful. Part and parcel in that is an early assessment of the school environment, particularly for children who've got physical difficulties. Like I say, some schools are beautiful and modern and have accessible areas and accessible facilities, but not all do. We've got some lovely, beautiful old schools as well, which are not so accessible. So getting it would be a community OT into the school to make an assessment of that school early on is really important if you think there's going to be difficulties, because it takes quite a long time to organise adaptations, particularly to be made in schools. If you need to adapt buildings and things like that, that takes quite a bit of work and planning and time to achieve that. And then there's just really simple things that can actually make a big difference. So it's not always the big things, is it? So just thinking about where that child is sitting in the classroom, how can you enhance that child's vision, hearing or communication just by where they're sat in the classroom can be really important. Thinking about how the pupil will get around school. So if somebody's in a wheelchair, obviously you're going to have to think about negotiating stairs and things like that. But actually, if you've got a pupil who's got difficulties with balance or is a little unsteady on their feet, equally that might be difficult for them, particularly if they're in a huge secondary school with hundreds of pupils flooding onto the corridors every time the bell goes. So thinking about, perhaps they can leave the class early, perhaps they can have a pass to go out if necessary. Those sort of things can be really helpful. And evacuation procedures is always something that needs to be looked at fairly early on as well, particularly if you've got to get somebody down from a second floor in a wheelchair when the fire alarm goes off. So things like that need to be looked at. Technology is being used more and more in schools now, and we're really fortunate that we're in a time where most children are used to using iPads and technology, and so that can be utilised really to help those children who have fine motor skills. So looking at how that can be utilised can be really helpful. And then also just making sure that the child's got a healthcare plan for any ongoing medical needs, and just so school feel confident about having the pupil back in. A lot of schools will worry about what happens if this child becomes unwell, what happened if this child falls over in the playground and bangs their head when they've had an operation on their brain a few weeks previously. So making sure that schools have got all that information and they know what to do and where to go if they've got any concerns is really important. That reassures school, and it also reassures the parents as well, which is really important for making sure it all goes smoothly. So just moving on to cognitive difficulties. I'm just going to touch on this really briefly. I'm not an expert in cognitive difficulties, but we do know that many of our children do go on to have some form of cognitive difficulty. Difficulties with processing speed is really, really common. So children might take longer to answer questions, might struggle to keep up in conversation during the classroom, or even actually at playtime, at break time when they're in conversation with their friends, they might struggle with those sorts of things. So processing speed can be an issue. As mentioned earlier, memory problems can also cause difficulties, and in itself that's going to impact on the child's ability to learn. Attention and concentration difficulties are common, and then later on in sort of the teenage years, difficulties with executive function come along, and that's part of the reason why it's really important to follow children throughout their childhood and support them throughout their education, because a child that's had a brain tumour as an infant, it's actually really difficult to know what their cognitive difficulties might be, because you're not going to expect a 5-year-old to be able to do the same things that you're going to expect a teenager to be able to do. And executive skills are really those things that come online during adolescence, that help children to be able to plan and organise and those sorts of things. So sometimes difficulties can actually not really make themselves known until quite a number of years later. So that's why it's important that families know that they can get back in contact with us, schools can get back in contact with us if they are worried about the pupil. So helpful strategies, again, not very specific, just generic things that are really useful for a lot of pupils. a lot of pupils with brain tumours, but actually quite a lot of pupils without brain tumours as well. And quite often when we'll go into schools, we'll say, oh, you know, it might be useful to try A, B and C in school. We'll say, well, actually we do that anyway because it helps all of our pupils. So it's not complicated stuff, it's just stuff that is useful for many children. So breaking tasks down into steps, repeating things frequently, the use of handouts and diaries, anything that's going to reduce the cognitive load, so anything that's going to reduce how much the child's having to manipulate in their mind at one time, or reduce how much they're having to think about and remember. Like I said about memory, if a teacher can give them a nice little piece of paper that tells them the homework, they don't have to write it down as they're going along and think about that while they're also thinking about what they're trying to learn. Minimising distractions can be helpful, very difficult in a busy classroom usually. Using prompts and cues, so trying to look at using recognition memory rather than recall memory, which is easier for quite a lot of pupils. And above anything else really, I would just say allowing that extra time for the pupil to think and answer questions is really helpful. Okay, psychosocial. So with all those physical and cognitive difficulties that children are having to deal with, they're also having to deal with ongoing monitoring by the hospital, coming back to us every 6 months or a year for a scan, coming back into that environment where they've probably had quite a difficult experience previously. That can all impact on their psychosocial self. So things like low self-esteem, issues relating to changes in body image. Social isolation has been mentioned previously, but yeah, purely from being in hospital for a long period of time, and then that getting back into education can impact on that. And then sadly, anxiety, low mood and depression are something that we do see in quite a few of our patients. So what can we do to try and mitigate against that? So regular contact from classmates whilst pupils are off school is really helpful. Fortunately, we live in a world where social media is around us all the time, and most of our teenagers spend half their time like this on a phone, don't they? So communicating with your friends is actually a lot easier now than it was previously, but still it can be difficult. And when you're in hospital having treatment for a brain tumour, the gap between you and your friends, I think, can sometimes seem quite wide. So sometimes children and young people do find it quite hard to maintain that contact with their school friends. So encouraging that as much as possible, getting them to go into school if they're able, even if it's just for an hour or so, can be really helpful. Peer sessions can help. So sometimes we might go into a school and obviously only if the child or the young person wants us to do this. We would never do it without their consent, and talk to their classmates or talk to a group of friends. Okay, 2 minutes, talk fast. About the situation they've been in, to try and help them understand so they can support their peer more easily. Buddy systems can be helpful, and then just accessing those support mechanisms such as the pastoral care teams, more formal counselling, or advice and support from our psychology team at the hospital. Right, I'm going to start whizzing through now because I'm running out of time. Fatigue, but I can't not mention fatigue because this is a massive issue for lots and lots of children and young people who've been treated for a brain tumour. And I'm talking about not just physical fatigue, but also cognitive fatigue. So that tiredness of having to use your brain all day in school, or use your brain to communicate with your peers, and just keep that going all the time. So this is not something that's going to be cured by a good night's sleep. That said, a good sleep routine is going to be helpful, or rather a poor sleep routine is not going to help it. So what can help? Strategies such as pacing, planning regular rest breaks during the day, doing an activity just for a set amount of time and then knowing that you're going to have a break. Teachers and TAs working to help the pupils spot early signs of fatigue and taking a break before they get too tired. sometimes a snack can help. And just that understanding and that acknowledgement that this isn't laziness. This pupil is really, really struggling to do something that, the peers in the class are going to find a lot easier, so they are working really hard. Okay, school's responsibilities. So the SENCO is the person in school who's got the ultimate responsibility to ensure that any child identified with having a special educational need is supported. So that's the go-to person to start with. That said, sometimes other people can also be helpful. In a lot of secondary schools, you've got year heads who are working quite closely with the pupils, so they can be really useful. Schools are obliged to make reasonable adjustments to meet the needs of children with special educational needs and disabilities. So they can't say, no, we're not going to do that. They do need to make reasonable adjustments and in order to meet those children's needs. The local authority has got the responsibility to arrange suitable education for our children who wouldn't receive it otherwise. So those children that are going through, a year's worth of chemotherapy and are spending most of the time at home laying on the sofa or on the bed, they can be referred for home education, and that's something that the school can do, or it's something that our hospital school can do if necessary. And just a little note on resources. I suspect that resources in schools are going to get less and less and less based on what I'm hearing in the news. But schools are provided with resources to support pupils with special educational needs as part of their main budget. And on top of that, if there are children who have got specific disabilities or needs that can't be met from within that budget, they can apply for additional funding from their local authority. How this is done varies considerably depending on what county you live in, and it seems to vary from school to school sometimes as well, depending on how proactive the school is. So it can be difficult, but it is there. In some counties, you would need to apply for an education health care plan, which I'm just going to briefly touch on. So this is a legal document, basically, that defines the needs of a child with any special educational needs. If you felt your child needed one of these, you could make an application for one. Schools can make applications for them, and so can health professionals. However, I have to say, my experience is the most effective way is for it to go through a school and for all the information to be pulled in from all the different professionals working with the child, to make sure everything's in the initial application for that EHCP. Otherwise they just get turned down, and then you have to start over again and reapply. So that's something that can be done if a child's needs aren't met, or if the school feels that they can't access the funding that they need without it. They also they look beyond just the education side of things, so they look at clinical commissioning groups as well. So if your child needs things like physiotherapy, speech therapy, things like that, they can also form part of an EHCP. Right, so I'm going to summarise now. Just to say that education can and should form a key part of ongoing rehabilitation for children and young people with brain tumours. Offering ongoing support to the pupil, family and school facilitates the child's return to education, enhancing their recovery and optimising their ability to reach their future potential. And getting it right is really important. So, questions? No, there's no time.